not going to answer you.
He's probably not. I wouldn't blame him if he doesn't.
Hello?
Hello, Alan?
Hey, John.
Yeah, this is John at the Acoustic Shoppe. This is the Alan Mundy. This is John at the Acoustic Shoppe. We started a new podcast, and we're kind of wondering if you're interested in possibly being on it.
A guest?
Well, I tell you what, let me check my schedule real quick. When do you want to do this?
Whenever it's convenient for you, man.
Some sort of weird echo going on.
There is a weird echo.
Are you available right now?
Again, let me check my schedule here real quick.
I can see there's nothing on there.
Yeah. Oh,
You didn't even look at your calendar.
I'll see if I can work it in.
All right, we'll make that happen.
All right.
Take me away, 'cause I can be the way. Let somebody while letting go and I can have my way.
All right, guys, we are back. It is another week of the Acoustic Shoppe Knows People, and today we have in the studio.
Yes.
It's not often
Live
that we
and
have
in
somebody
person.
in the studio.
Very rare we get someone
Live and
to
a
come
person.
here and visit with us.
Live and a person. Actually, one of my all-time favorite people, and I do genuinely mean this. Alan Mundy is one of my favorite people, not just as far as a musician, but he has become just the coolest guy to hang out
I
with.
don't think we've become that. I think we just discovered that he has been that.
It was recently that
He's
this
become
happened.
to us one of the coolest guys we hang out with.
Right. That's because you hang out with yourself so much.
Exactly
Yeah,
right.
we don't.
Anybody outside the circle is
No,
pretty
seriously, do you find that you have changed a lot in the last couple of years since you've been hanging out with the Chapmans?
I've become a better person. Yes.
cool. You're welcome.
Truly, truly.
You're welcome. The gift of our company.
Yes, it is. It is.
This is really exciting. We've talked about this on some of our live streams before, but we've grown up listening to Alan Mundy, and obviously Dad was highly influenced by your playing. And then I think you used to visit Springfield on and off for a while because your wife kind of her roots are from Springfield, Missouri.
Yes, yes. And actually, even Country Gazette played here, I'm going to say many times, because it's a real vibrant musical community. Springfield is and has been for a very long time.
Absolutely. And then, again, and we'll go back to some of that history, but then I met you when you were just coming through town, hanging out for a little while, and you were at Bo Brown's house doing a jam session. He invited me over, and I was very thankful for that and a little intimidated that Alan Mundy was going to be there. And I was like, I hope I don't really suck this time. And I only mediocrely sucked on that occasion. I stepped up my game.
Weird,
Moderate suckage. Which is generally, it's your baseline.
Yeah. Which I thought that was a step up with the pressure that was involved. But no, it was very cool to get to actually hang out with you and realize how fun and dry of a sense of humor you have at that jam session, and also how seemingly little ego you had, which is very refreshing when one of your heroes is also very down to earth and fun to be around.
Well, thank you. I'll go along with all that, and truly,
Including the mediocrity.
well, no.
You're allowed to.
Moderate
Trust me.
suckage.
This is all allowed in this particular podcast.
I want honesty here.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Honestly, all these guys are great, great players, and that's honest. And their dad, Bill, is a great player too. And y'all made really great music, together over the years when you were traveling more. And I've seen you live a time or two since I've been in town, and it's
We've
brilliant.
had a bunch of fun.
I'll say it's brilliant.
Well, I think that's a little bit of an overstatement,
Okay.
but I do appreciate it though.
It's moderately sucking. No. And then you actually made the actual move to Springfield, and you've been here for 4 years now?
I'll say at least three, but maybe four. Yeah.
And then the really cool results of that is you're a fellow that likes to walk and get some exercise. And all of a sudden, here comes Alan Mundy walking down the street, showing up at the shop on a pretty regular basis. And it's like, how cool is this that Alan just comes to hang out at the shop?
Yeah.
And it's really been enjoyable to get to know you on a more personal level and also talk about music history, and all the different stories have been very interesting. And actually, one of the inspirations for starting this podcast is some of these stories that we get to hear. We got to capture some of the stuff. And that's the idea behind the podcast, to just talk to some of our heroes and hear some of their stories. And you were like pretty far down the list, but we bumped you up.
What he's saying is, Grandpa, tell us a story.
Yeah. Well, before we started, we're talking a little bit about guitar and in bluegrass. And I noticed a lot of the early guitar players in bluegrass played with a thumb pick.
Yep.
I think Charlie Monroe did, Clyde Moody, I'll say. And when I lived out in West Texas, there was a family out there, the Mayfields, which Ed Mayfield, who played with Monroe back in the 50s, was part of the Mayfield family from Dimmitt, Texas. And he died actually when he was working with Bill Monroe. And he was a World War II veteran, and I think was one of the stories was that after, Nagasaki and Hiroshima, they sent American troops in there, and he was part of the troops that went in and maybe got radiated a little much at the time and died fairly quickly after that in the 50s of leukemia.
Yeah.
And was on the road with Monroe. But his whole family that I knew out in West Texas, there was Ed, who I never knew, but I knew Herb Mayfield, who was a brother, and then Smokey Mayfield, who was a brother. And they played music in West Texas and were kind of a big deal locally out there. And they all played guitar when they played guitar with a thumb pick. And there's even a recording of Ed doing what we would call now flat picking. But I'm assuming he did it by just holding his thumb and using his his thumb pick as a flat pick. And so there, at some point, and Lester Flatt famously was,
of course, yeah,
beautiful, beautiful player that way. At some point, guitar players switched over to the flat pick. And I'm not sure, it'd be interesting to kind of get a sense of that, but after Lester Flatt was with Bill Monroe, it was Mac Wiseman, and Mac used a flat pick, and then Jimmy Martin after that, and then all the way after that, everybody used flat picks. And I was talking with our good buddy Pete Rowan, Pete, and he was commenting on using a thumb pick some, and he felt it, oddly enough, was easier to sing because it required less, I'm going to say, weight of his arm, on his guitar, to where when you put that weight on there, it pushes onto your stomach and ultimately your lungs, and sort of crowds your lungs out when you go to sing, so to speak. So he felt it was a little easier to sing if you played with a thumb pick. Plus, it's a little less active emotion.
I can see that.
Yeah, because to get an upstroke with a thumb pick is kind of hard, and
That's very
Lester
hard.
would do it with his finger. And I think Carter Stanley also was a thumb pick guy. So there's, in some nuanced way but profound way, it affected bluegrass music and, just the sense of it and what you could do or felt like you could do and whatnot. So it's when they went from thumb picks to flat picks, I think there was a shift, a subtle shift in the music that is with us to this day.
Maybe that led to more of the flat pick soloing going on.
Absolutely, absolutely. And not that there weren't any flat pickers. Don Reno, Red Smiley, both of those people played with a flat pick. And Don
It's
was
interesting.
a
You'd think
picker.
they would have the thumb pick.
You would think
Banjo.
that, you would think that, wouldn't you? Or he would play the guitar in a style like he played his banjo with thumb, index thumb, like that. So it's all real intriguing. And I would offer one more quick observation from a banjo player about guitars is I played with Jimmy Martin and all the players that I played with prior to that, when they would play a G chord, they played it with the B string open.
Yep.
So you get a true G chord. It's a G major
1, 3,
chord.
and a 5.
Yes. You get the 3 in there that defines it as a major. And after playing with him, I went to California to play with Country Gazette and was playing with Roger Bush, who was the bass player. And he played guitar where he covered the B string and played a D. So now what you're getting is G, and you don't play the fifth string. It's sort of muted. And you play, so it's G, D, G, D, G. So there's no third.
Yep.
So it all of a sudden sort of clears up the muddle of sound in the guitar world in a sense. And I asked him, I said, I've never heard anybody play like that. I never even thought about doing that. Where did you learn to do that? And he said, well, that's the way Clarence did it. So Clarence sort of is, in my mind, sort of introduced. Now, I could be very wrong, and there may be other stories.
It would definitely make sense because you have, Tony, that's where most modern guitar players know. Tony did it that way, and that was, he was a Clarence fanatic.
Right. And so, but I asked Roger, and maybe I even asked Clarence, I can't remember, because Clarence and I were big buddies,
Tightest of tight.
Oh, yeah. We were just like that. So, but I think it comes from James Burton, because Clarence did a lot of studio work. He did the Byrds and had done a lot of studio work, and probably noticed that James Burton, who was Elvis's guitar player, and before that, Ricky Nelson, and was a studio guy in L.A., did it that way, and that's probably where he got it. Ultimately, was from James Burton. So
I think it's actually, I'm going to interject my opinion of here. B strings never get tuned. Nobody ever makes a B string sound right. You know that. And I think that was the real reason.
The real motivating factor.
You can't tell me Jimmy had an in-tune B string.
I'm not going to argue with you. Now, he might, but I'm not going to take up his causes. But as a result of that, what happened is, I'm going to use the word diatonic for having that B string open. It means of the scale.
Sure.
So the music, to really blend in a certain way, had to be diatonic of the scale. And so music in bluegrass was sort of that way. There were things that weren't. Clinch Mountain Backstep, for instance, Ralph Stanley and his brother played, if you listen closely, it's a G chord, but what he's playing is more of a G minor. And so there is a clash, but it's, they were cool about it. But if you take that B out, it doesn't matter whether it's major or minor.
Sure.
So you get not all of a sudden, but you get this explosion of non-diatonic music, of solos and all the flatted fives and flat thirds and flat sevens, because there's no clash with the guitar mostly. So, and your banjo playing changes, somewhat. So, to me, that was another subtle yet profound change in bluegrass that came apart because of the guitar.
But here's the more important question. Foggy Mountain Breakdown, minor or major E?
Well, now that's
this is like the biggest
arm wrestling.
Yeah, this is the biggest important question in all of bluegrass music, because the original recording, Lester Flatt played an E major chord
definitely
over an E minor
Melody line.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So which was right?
Absolutely true. Well, here's the deal.
If he had only dropped that third, it wouldn't have mattered.
Right. But here's the deal. This is my opinion. I've not talked to anybody about it. But if you listen to...
Here first, folks.
Yeah. If you listen to other recordings, not a Foggy Mountain Breakdown, but other songs that go to a minor chord in sort of the folk world, and I'm going to point to Charlie Monroe did a song called Down in the Willow Garden. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to say he did it in G. And it goes to what we would think of as an E minor. But he went to E major. And again, Jimmy Martin recorded an instrumental, he called it Wild Indian, but it's Lonesome Indian, which is in the key of D and goes to B minor, what we would identify as a B minor.
Sure.
And if you listen to the recording, he goes Actually, it's a B7th is what he plays, but it's a major chord. So, in a sense, that minor against the major was somewhat in a tradition, of in their minds that was a sound that was not unusual, I'll say. And it also is, I'll use the word naive about music.
Sure.
And sort of the theory of music or the intent of things. And
I can almost feel like it's part of that growth in there. I mean, we've talked about this. Talk about Jason can get involved in this one too. Early bluegrass recordings, even some of the Jimmy Martin recordings and all that, where the bass was not actually following the chord structure line of where this was actually being. And you can correct me, you worked with Jimmy, but from what I was told, the concern was not necessarily with the bass of what the notes that were being played, but more about the timing and the filling up of that spectrum of sound that needed to be kind of put in there.
Right. And I'm going to say, I've listened to a lot of Jimmy Martin recordings, and I don't notice too many wrong bass notes. Bill Monroe is another story for lots of reasons. They probably... Bill was notorious for just going into the studio and recording without rehearsing too much or
Sure.
so. And the one that comes to my mind is Uncle Pen. I think has some
Conflicting notes.
issues in it. But even early, if you go back to his early recordings before the banjo, you'll still find some really funky bass things going on. And I think at that point, I think you're accurate, just to have a low thump.
Create some energy.
Yeah, and just to identify where the beat is.
I always understood it to be they picked up somebody on the side of the road whenever they were a bass player. Because bass players, as we know to this day, are unimportant.
That is absolutely fact.
Hey,
Let's go ahead.
Can you hold this thing
this.
and pluck the strings randomly?
Hey, you look like you
Kitty
could
is
stand
now
up
about
straight
to
for an hour or two.
listening to this.
But anyway, I enjoy holding forth and talking about stuff like this. And I would say, for people that are really into this, which I can be, is if you were to do an old Flat and Scruggs song, let's say Head Over Heels in Love with You, and you wanted to get it to sound more like the recording or the way they performed it, you would play it, as a guitar player, you would play it with that B string open. And you would be more into the sound. Whereas if you covered that B string, it would be, to me,
Modern variation.
Yeah, sort of a modernish take on it. So it's, and I'll say all this only as if you're interested in these sort of little picky things about the music. But what else have we got?
Yeah, we're here to talk about just stuff.
Yeah.
So what is your theory? All right, how much of this is that it was just a bunch of guys that didn't have any formal music education, didn't really know probably a lot about major versus minor and following chord scales, that it was just, this sounds interesting to me, or this sounds right, so I'll put in the major here, so that minor over the minor. And it seemed to happen pretty regular for Monroe and Stanley, where they'd add like these half measures all of a sudden in the middle of the song. How much was that was just not having the structure of the music theory as it had been traditional, educational wise, since the classical period, to these guys are just picking up instruments and learning how to play them? And
I would say a lot myself, just because, if you see where they came from and what they were doing before that, and many of them had no musical training at all. I think Mac Wiseman actually went to a music school, and if you listen to his music, there's hardly any of the sort of high, lonesome, bluesy stuff in Mac Wiseman's music, where Monroe is, full of it. And it's interesting to me nowadays that the sound of bluegrass music, much of it, if you had a dividing line, I would say much of it is on the high, lonesome sound side of the thing, where, Mac Wiseman, you'd have kind of on the, I'll say, pretty.
Well, Mac was an interesting side of this, right? Because a lot of people don't remember, one, that Mac was part of the Bluegrass Boys, and that is, I've talked to a lot of people that don't remember that, and at that point, boy, Mac was singing high. I mean, singing high.
Yeah.
He's singing with Monroe, and then we move on to the music that actually came, I think, and correct me, I'm gonna say late 50s, early 60s, which was almost like bubblegum pop type stuff that was going on during that time period. He was doing these very, teeny bopper type of, I know I'm making that sound like it's very cheesy, but it was in that vein of what was going on in that period of time. And he was a crooner almost, at that point.
Yes.
And then comes back to a bluegrassy world sound of a mix of, I guess, both of those two sounds.
Sure.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, sure. When I was young, Pat Boone had a hit with a song called Love Letters in the Sand.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that was a Mac Wiseman song. Mac Wiseman did that in sort of a bluegrass context, but it's still the same song that, like you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So, he had sort of this popish sensibility about him. And for those of you who are interested, if you go on YouTube, there is some YouTube mini, actually, of the Ozark Jubilee, of which Mac Wiseman was on, I think, one episode and sang 2 songs. And one of them was the Ballad of Davy Crockett, which was a popular TV show at the time. Yeah. And he had a recording of it, so he wasn't, today we think of him as essentially bluegrass. And in the end, I think he gave in and did that, but he wanted to be sort of a popular, and I'll use the term folk performer.
Yeah, absolutely.
But like Burl Ives-ish, Well,
wasn't that a time period, again, this is always my favorite part of having these conversations with Alan, by the way, is we get to kind of ask.
Wrong.
Yeah, we get to ask these questions because you were more into, that was, you got into bluegrass what year, roughly?
In the late 50s, early 60s.
Okay. So, yeah, this is the time period that we're kind of, curious about. You got in that 60s time period, I'm going to say mid-60s and all that, that's when bluegrass kind of had this world of being more folk-like, which was a very interesting time for bluegrass music in general. These were folk stars. Flatt and Scruggs became a folk act, for them. Even Lester Flatt was getting pitched all these Bob Dylan tunes and things that were a little bit more out there.
Absolutely.
And then you had bands like Seldom Seen that start jumping in here, and now they're with Smithsonian Folkways, and it is a folk world that was really blending, and I'm curious, here's my curiosity side of this became more of a pop folky kind of world, which was booming in the 60s, right? How's Monroe handling this idea that his music now is not necessarily just bluegrass, but a subdivision of folk music? And I don't know if you have any insight on that or anything.
Only from, we were talking earlier about Neil Rosenberg's history of bluegrass music, and just looking at Monroe's recorded output compared with some others. You look at Flatt and Scruggs, they did a whole album of folk songs of America, I'll say. But it's got folk songs in the title.
Sure.
And they did a song famously called The Johnson Boys, which is not a song they knew. It's a song they learned from a group called the New Lost City Ramblers, which was a early recreation of the folk string band music of the 20s and before. And so they were totally aware, and I think mostly through Louise, who managed the group, and then Earl's sons, who were,
definitely in that world.
Yeah, very much so. And you can see how Earl, after he left Lester, gravitated towards, the music of the Byrds, which is kind of a folk rock, sort of country folk rockish thing. And so that whole sense of trying to capture a younger audience was part of the deal, I think, and different than the Grand Ole Opry crowd.
Sure, absolutely. And it was, like you said, I think record sales went through a second major boom for bluegrass artists. I mean, that was a major change for a lot. And we had a lot of new acts that were starting to come. Like I said, we got Seldom Seen in here. You've got the Osborne Brothers, who have now shifted their sound even further towards the country world during this time period. Actually, it was probably a little later in the late 60s, early 70s, probably a little bit more so. But a very interesting, I always find this interesting, and we've talked about this a bunch, right? Is what people consider to be traditional bluegrass of today that hold, and again, I'm not arguing that you shouldn't fight for, traditional aspects of music, whatever style of music that you want. But the only thing that I have problems with is recognizing that what people consider to be traditional music right now never was traditional music. You know what I mean? I mean, if we go, I mean, this is a tired argument, but Monroe was not traditional music. This was a total change in the landscape of what traditional music was at that period of time. And to this day, people, when I grew up, Mac Wiseman was a super traditional group. And like we said, this was almost pop music at one period in time. We get into Seldom Seen, we get into Country Gentlemen, all these, that's how this music gets to kind of be a new world. And I know I'm beating a dead horse here, but
the problem that everybody forgets is those people were all trying to make a living and be as big a star as they could be. And they followed the music where it went, and they forget that now because it's so held up on a pedestal as a tradition that we have to do it exactly the way it was done. But then you just need to realize that this was always music. It was a music business, not just they're making their own way with their own music, and we're not trying to be everybody else. So
that's absolutely correct, I think. And I think that's why, Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs did this folk music thing. And they did an album of the Carter family, which is, sort of to a certain extent, the invention of folk music was the Carter family. Mm-hmm. And because they thought they could sell the records. Yeah. Where I'll Still Write Your Name in the Sand, or not that one, what is it? Any of those, Take Me in Your Lifeboat, or any of those.
The super traditional.
Yeah, Head Over Heels, and all of that sort of stuff, because that was country music. Yeah. And they wanted to do the folk music. And I remember talking, I actually got this from him, Jim and Jesse, Jesse McReynolds. And their first two albums were called, one of them was called Bluegrass Special, and the second one was maybe called Bluegrass Classics or something like that. And I asked him, I said, and they came out in the early 60s. And I said, who came up with the names of those albums? And he said, it was that guy in New York or Washington, D.C., and I think he was talking about Ralph Rensler. He didn't know the name. But Ralph was Bill Monroe's manager, and he came from a whole totally different, at one time, at a different world, where he was on the outside looking in and said, this is what bluegrass is. And he's the one that sort of made the initial, bluegrass is different than country music. It's more folk, it's of the people. It's acoustic, it's banjos and mandolins, it's not steel guitars. And so it's different. It's special to us people on the outside looking in. Well, the people on the inside, Jim and Jesse, Mac Wiseman, Jesse said, we didn't like using the word bluegrass because that immediately made you different than country music. And both Mac Wiseman and I think many, Jimmy Martin, Jim and Jesse, and probably Reno and Smiley, the whole wad of those people saw themselves as just the acoustic end of country music. Sure. And they wanted their records to be in the country music bins. They didn't want them set over here in the bluegrass bin or folk bin because that wasn't their people in their minds. Yourself. Yeah, it was you're limiting yourself. Sure. If you did that. And it's easy to see who won. The ones that wanted to split off were the ones that won. And for me, I'm going to say this, I'm glad they did, because country music was moving on and wants nothing to do with bluegrass. And I remember at one of the IBMA events, they had a gentleman named Tony Brown, who was a really big shot in Nashville. And he made this statement, and I believe it to be true. He said, everybody in Nashville loves bluegrass. There's not a country artist or a record producer that doesn't love bluegrass, but it doesn't sell records. You have to follow what the people want. Most of the people want. The majority of the people want, because you're trying to sell records. And if you're doing, oh no, we're going to do bluegrass, right away, it just, as hard as it is to say, there's people, if you can believe this, that hear bluegrass music and don't like it.
Sure.
No way.
I believe it.
I'm sorry.
I sadly do believe it. Jeremy doesn't, but I actually believe it.
Well, but it's just the way of the world. But it's still a market. Mm-hmm. It is what it is.
It's a passion. Like a lot of the people that are in there, like you're saying, the record exec, obviously they're going to make the financial decision, say, all right, this is country music. This is the thing we market and promote. We're going to go ahead and put this in its own bin. The people that are making that personal decision, that I understand that I'm not going to make that kind of Garth Brooks effect on my livelihood, but I'm just passionate about bluegrass. It becomes a decision that's, I can make a living on this. It's not a financial decision on whether or not to play bluegrass.
Right. But if you work it right, you can, and here I am, I will say I'm 76 years old. And from the day I left college, I haven't done anything else. And I'm not wealthy, but I'm not, going around picking
made
up.
a career out
of it.
You
don't have a car, but that's my choice again. He does have a car. He just likes to walk.
Yeah. But anyway, you get the...
But there's levels to this in all genres. Even if you talk mainstream country, there's the fight that they're having again now with country music, where traditional country music is being left behind in, modern country. The same thing with rock genres. It's always, I think it's a variable scale.
I think it's even happening in pop genres. I get a kick out of this in watching the latest big giant super mega stars, and they kind of sit there and had the battle of, we want our music back. And I'm like, all right, I see that, but aren't you also part of this? And again, I'm not trying to call anybody out here, but this is just, I
want names.
This is music in general. And I think that's the thing that we all need to get back to recognizing is music is an art form. Not everything that happens is your favorite or my favorite. And even though we can, a lot of us, I think just about everybody kind of picks a form of music or a few forms of music that they absolutely love, but they don't love everything within that. And I think that's something that another side of this that people need to recognize is you don't need to. It's art. I make this analogy a lot with students, with everything else. Music is art. And I've gone to a whole bunch of art museums throughout the years.
Two.
Like two. and I walk through exhibits of things that I just don't get. And what I've had to learn to teach myself is to not go, that is awful. Because here's the facts. I may not get it, and I think it's awful, but to somebody, it's the most beautiful thing in the entire world. And that's art, and music is art. And we got to get back to doing that. I've had a lot of discussion with players that, look at technicality of these things that just like, well, that's, they're not doing this, they're not doing this, and they're not doing that, so it's not any good. I also know a lot of those people that make that same kind of music that a lot of people love to listen to and buy those albums. So
right.
It's art.
Well, there's always going to be, as he was saying, musicians that look out into the world and go, what are people buying? I'm going to do that. And then there are musicians that look out and go, what do I like? I'm going to do that. And, the people that do it for, make conscious decisions to go for where the money is, doesn't mean that they don't have, music they love that they know they can never.
Commercial sellable.
They're not commercial and going to sell. But the cool thing is this is America, and you get to do whatever you want, even though, and part of it is driven by money, but it doesn't have to be. And you can't judge something's value or worth by whether it makes money or not. It can make a little money, it can make a lot of money, and all the things in between. And if you're willing to adjust your lifestyle to go with your interests and your income, you could have like me. For me, I've had a very happy life. I've done well, both doing things I enjoy doing and make enough money to keep the wolves away from the door.
There's that kind of exchange in life where, and I've talked about this with these guys before, someone like you that's, as talented as you are as a musician, there are very successful people that have dedicated most of their life to making money and making a good living. We'll do concerts sometimes where this guy has a massive mansion and a big old boat, and he'll come up to you and say, boy, I would give anything to be able to play music like you do. I wish I could have learned how to play an instrument. And, obviously they probably won't give up their boat and their house to do it, but there is that in the back of their mind that I made this career path, and yes, I am financially secure right now and I have all these things, but you do something that I could never do, and I really envy. So even some of the most successful people in the world envy the choice that was made of not necessarily going for the financial route, but putting the effort into making and dedicating your life to music.
Yeah. Well, in those cases, I always offer those people, I'll sell my career to them.
By the way, how expensive is that career?
It's going down.
Jeremy, quick, give me a situation where somebody needs an instrument fast.
There is a band that's performing. You want to get backstage. You don't know how to get backstage, but you're a huge fan. So you grab a guitar, you walk backstage and say, hey, I got to get this to the lead singer. He needs it now.
All right, John, give me a situation quickly where they can get that guitar.
Well, here's the deal. You guys can go to theacousticshoppe.com and get on there. You can search for guitars. You can check by brand. You can check by style. All those different things. Order it. It will be shipped that day, if not the very next day.
Now give me a situation where they need a banjo.
There's no need for a banjo. Everybody knows nobody needs a banjo.
But if you did need a banjo, you go to theacousticshoppe.com. Like John said, check us out. And thanks for supporting the podcast.
I can't think of a reason.
Nobody has a reason for a banjo.
Dad.
Here's a question I have for you, Alan, and this is just out of curiosity. I know you as a pretty broad, your spectrum of what you listen to and know of music is pretty darn wide. I know you play jazz guitar. You've got into other genres besides bluegrass. You love bluegrass, I'm pretty sure, and the traditional aspect of it. My question is, what point in your career do you find that you were always had such a broad, you like such a broad amount of music? Or was there a time period when you were very focused on the traditional side of what bluegrass was and where it was? And did it take like a maturity for you to recognize, hey, wait, this is all great music and this all helps me out?
Well, from the very beginning, first day I ever realized I liked music, which is I don't even know how old I was, probably 10 or 11. It's always been the same, I think. And in my family, there was no adult musician. My mother and dad did not play music. But in the house, we had a record player, and this is back in the days of when albums were albums. They were in a large folder, and you'd have, to have one symphony, it'd take, 7 or 8 discs or more, because they were 78s back then. Thomas Edison, by the way, was a good friend of the family.
Really?
No.
Really? That's pretty awesome.
No. I just thinking about how far that may seem to some people back in the stone. They were made of stone.
You got to crank it?
Yeah. But I would play, and it would be an album of Strauss waltzes. And I'd put them on. Nobody told me there's records in there, go listen to them or anything. I discovered them and put them on and went, wow, I'm liking this. And I think in the looking back, it's this idea of melodies. And I'll say, and lush harmonies, I'll say also. but melodies and harmonies sort of attracted me. But I soon got into the guitar, and I'll confess this. Actually, the first instrument was the accordion, and I have a younger sister and two older brothers, and the oldest brother played the accordion for a while because my dad was a big accordion fan. He's from back east. He was from Providence, Rhode Island. Although he was Irish descent, he liked the accordion and sort of the Italian-esque part of it. You know, Lady of Spain and Third Man Theme.
Not polka.
Not the polka stuff so much, but melodies, you know, popular melodies. So my brother Mike played some, and then my youngest sister Gail played accordion, and she took lessons. This was back in the day when the instructor would come to the house. Y'all might look into that.
It's a good business model.
Yeah. She would come to the house and have a 30-minute lesson, and I would wait outside the room she was in, and I even remember the teacher's name. Her name was Nancy Carter, and she was a student at the University of Oklahoma and had been runner-up for Miss Oklahoma, but her talent was, you know, in the talent portion of the show, she played accordion. So there she was, and my sister would take lessons, and then after the lesson, she would come in and show me what she had learned, and I would play. And I always thought it was interesting that my parents were giving my sister the accordion lessons, but I was learning. But they never ever said, well, Alan, would you like to take accordion lessons, you know, too?
Why is
There's
it?
never a chance of you ever becoming Miss America.
No, there's that. That's part of it. That was probably the real reason.
That's the real reason.
They had hopes for my sister, possibly. But anyway, I got into the sound of the guitar and liked it. And like I say, the folk music boom, and then there was banjos, and I heard the banjo and wanted to do that. And then a friend of ours, of mine that lived down the street, a neighborhood playmate, noticed my interest in the banjo and got me, for Christmas, Foggy Mountain banjo with Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs. And that was like,
That's it.
man.
That's what ignited the fire.
I can listen to that record and the Dillards' first record and sort of recreate hearing it the first time. You know, it never, I can, you know, put myself in that space and listen to it kind of the same way I did then. But I remember listening to the Flatt and Scruggs record and going, that is the most incredible thing I've ever heard. I can't imagine any human being able to do it, but that person does it, and maybe I can do it too. So I got a banjo, and, you know, that's kind of the interesting thing about bluegrass is it's so inviting. You know, people hear it, and you see friends and neighbors get together and just do it, and you go, well, maybe I can do that. If they can do it, they're not any, you know, great talented people. He's an auto mechanic, and she's a nurse and whatever, and she teaches school, or he's does this or that or the other, but they're playing music together, and I think I could do that. So, and that's one of the really wonderful parts of the music. And can I mention one thing Bill Keith told me? And at an event not much different than this, somebody asked a group, what is bluegrass music? And they all had, you know, these answers about, well, they're these songs of home, and they're played on the acoustic instruments, and, you know, they defined sort of the elements of it. But he said something I think was really more meaningful. He said, bluegrass is anything you can go to a jam session and play immediately. You know, so if you want to introduce a new song into a bluegrass session, it's got to be one that sounds familiar. You know,
Sure.
So,
I get the idea.
Yeah. You know, so he said any song that you can, even if it's not a bluegrass, quote, song, it could be if the people playing bluegrass recognize it and play it.
Sure.
You know, so in a sense, that was a better take on what bluegrass really is to a certain extent. It's songs people hear that they think they could play.
I like the theory.
Relatability of it.
Yeah, just, and it's like Monroe's line, that ain't no part of nothing. Well, you know, in a sense, he's right. if he says that about a song, it just means he doesn't recognize the elements in it enough to be part of his world.
So we have just officially unlocked the statement
That
ain't no part of nothing. Alan did it right here, right on this podcast.
You may say that it's valid, but it's a double negative and it just doesn't work. That is some part of something.
Well, you have to take them where they come from.
Okay, just like the minor over a major chord.
Right, exactly.
The same.
These are the same people that don't quite recognize minor and major.
This is really the fun part of when you come over, getting to have sometimes goofy and pointless conversations, but a lot of times somewhat deep, meaningful parts of the history of bluegrass music in particular, but music in general, some of your knowledge base to that. And one of the coolest things I thought I found interesting as now music store owners is the impact that your local music store had on you. You've talked about before what that meant as a beginning musician evolving to have that kind of base of a local music store. Where was that?
Well, I'm from Norman, Oklahoma, and the store was called Mike Ritchie's Guitar Center. And Mike Ritchie went on to become this character named Slim Ritchie, who I knew. I walked into his store when I was 14 and knew him till the day he died and was friends with him. And he was a great mentor because he was a really fine musician and had, I think, a fairly good grasp of reality and sort of the strength and the silliness of musics. And I remember he would had drug around to bluegrass festivals this trailer and sold records. And he had a sign up that said, "Buy one, get one." And people would buy one and they'd say, "Well, now where's my free one?" He says, "It doesn't say that. It says buy one and you get one. You get the one you bought."
We're going to try that marketing campaign in the store.
Right. So anyway, but, before the internet and before YouTube and before all the things that we have now, before bluegrass magazines and all this, where you would pick up information was at the music store. You go down, hang out at the music store. Someone would come in and they'd try out a guitar and they'd play some cool stuff on it. And you just, whoa, just all sorts of people I met at Mike Ritchie's. And I got hanging out there enough that he finally hired me to teach some banjo at some point and a little bit of guitar. And I was still in college at the time. But I would hang out there, and I saw Conway Twitty lived around Norman, and he'd come into the store.
Really?
Yeah, very cool. And his band. And I would hang out and listen to what they had to say and how musicians talked and what they talked about.
Sure.
When they talked about music.
You can't repeat most of that.
Sailors.
Yeah. So the music store was the center of everything for me for music. I met Byron Berline there.
Yep.
I met the first other banjo player that I saw that could play three-fingered style. His name was Ralph Thomas, and he was a postal worker from Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and he was friends with Byron. Byron brought him in. And I met some other young players that I played with there. So that's where things happened.
Sure.
And I would learn about, they would put up flyers for concerts and club events and things. So
we don't allow any of that anymore.
What was the formation of your first band, actual official band? Was it in that era when you were hanging around that store?
I think it was this way. I was at the store, and somebody had brought in an F. Is it 4? Is that the overhold? Yeah. An F4 that they had sent back to Gibson to be refinished. And they came in to pick it up. And it was a guy named Brian Nielsen, and he was my age. And so, do you play? Oh, yeah, I like to play. Do you like bluegrass? Oh, yeah. So I met him, and then he knew a guy that his age that played guitar. Len Baroff was his name. And I'd go over there. I'd say, I play banjo. And this is before I even really was Scruggs-ish. I knew just a couple things, and we'd go over there, mostly to Len's house that I remember. But and we would, Len was really good he understood music, I thought, pretty well, as did Brian, and I was learning. So they were great. You know, they were my age. So, and we had a group that we ultimately called the East Ridge Ramblers, because I lived on East Ridge Road.
Right, of course.
So there was
You need to
that.
put Rambler or Mountain Boy in it somehow.
Yeah, you had to do
You
that.
had to. I mean, nobody would know what kind of band you were otherwise.
So you mentioned the store stuff's great, but you were talking about Slim Richie. Slim Richie also had an effect on the overall scene, right? Didn't start a record label, if I remember right.
He did in 1975, and I recorded Banjo Sandwich was his first project, and that was my first solo recording. And so, and he carried on and had a label for many years called Ridge Runner.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure. I was going to say Ridge Runner, but I couldn't remember exactly,
Right.
and I didn't want to. I was going to let you make me out to be an idiot, and
That's been the entire podcast.
but we got to that goes into even how we got into music. First time I remember, obviously the Banjo Sandwich album, and I knew the Ridge Runner albums, but I got to meet Slim at Bluegrass Festival. One of the very first festivals we ever did in the Midwest was in Hugo, Oklahoma. I want to tell you, if you guys had never been there, I think it's still going to this day, maybe. I'm not sure. But Bill Grant was running that festival. I want to say, sorry, folks in Hugo, Oklahoma, but I believe that to be the official armpit of the U.S., the hottest place I have
sign to
ever.
hell.
Is that what that is? We had come there from Colorado. I got to tell you the story of this. We go to our very
That's
first.
more speaking of us than it is them, but
Well, yeah, it's not the people. We come from Colorado. We did bluegrass festivals where at night, it's like 50 degrees, even in the summertime, and it's in the mountains. We're camping and we're doing the whole deal. So we're like, we're going to go see one of these real bluegrass festivals. So we go out to Hugo.
and also preface that with Dad worked in a mountain outdooring store called EMS, Eastern Mountain Sports. So all of our camping gear consisted of 20 below zero down sleep bags and inflatable mattress on the.
Everest expedition tents and all that kind of good
We
stuff.
were ready.
We were ready. So we go to Hugo, Oklahoma. Huge lineup, great festival. I mean, it was one of the classic bluegrass festivals of the U.S., right? It was one of the oldest, if not, I know there's older festivals than that, but it was a long-running festival. Huge lineup, some of the greatest all-stars of all time. And here we go, showing up as our first big bluegrass festival with all that camping gear. And we get into town, it's midnight, and the bank has the sign, with the temperature on the outside. And I think it was like midnight, and it's still like 98 degrees outside, and a humidity level of unbelievable proportions. That said, huge crowd, great bunch of artists and stuff. And Slim Richie is there. I got to meet him as a celebrity because he was selling albums and instruments out of a tent out there and doing his whole deal. And that to me was super cool. I remember that very, very well. Dad comes over to me and says, this guy right here, that's who came up with these albums that you know of and the whole thing.
Well, another thing about Slim, and I'll say this as if it's true because I think it is. But
Go for it.
Go for it. And it may be antithetical to what you all are doing, but Slim had a music store, a physical store at one time. And then when he got in later, he got into what we'll call mail order. And he had a business called, what was it called? Warehouse Music Sales, and would send out a catalog, newsprint catalog. And he would sell Martin guitars, brand new, for, I'll say, 30% off or something. Everything had either 10 to 30% off. And he, I'll say, maybe not all by himself, but was in part responsible for sort of breaking the hold of music stores. If the guitar is $1,500, it's $1,500. There's no bargaining. This Martin D18 is $1,500. If you want to buy it, it's $1,500. And people got to where they would take the catalog into the store and show them in the catalog that they could buy that same guitar brand new for $1,300. And so the stores first complained to Martin that there's this guy selling guitars. And Slim had been in a business prior to that of, and this is once again before the internet, of buying and selling whatever anybody wanted to buy or sell. It wasn't his business. He worked for somebody, and they wanted, I need 2 million of this kind of clip that goes in the air conditioner ducts or something. And he would go around, call around on the phone and find a supplier for those and connect up those two people and make the sale and sort of a broker. And that's how he did the guitars. Somebody would order a Martin D18. He would call around to music stores who were kind of stiffed, and you probably are aware of these kinds of deals maybe, is that back then if you had a Martin franchise, you had to buy a lot of Martin's product, even if it wasn't stuff you wanted. You had to buy a certain amount. You need to take these guitars. And so these stores would get stuck with certain guitars that they couldn't sell. He would call them up, call around till he found one and say, well, I'll give you $1,000 for it. Well, they paid $900 for it. It's been there 6 months or a year and they need to get rid of it. They sell it to him and he would sell it at a discount to the buyers. And Martin would send notices around to music stores, do not sell to Slim Ritchie. But what they couldn't break was the store needing the money. And being stuck with instruments they couldn't sell. So Slim could sell them. So it's kind of a good American solution to that kind of a problem. So Slim got, that was one of his things that he did for America. Contributions.
And now we're trying to undo that and say, all right, it says 1,500 on it, it's 15.
Well, fortunately, Slim doesn't have warehouse music sales anymore.
I remember no matter what Slim says.
Yes, no matter what Slim says,
this is what it is. That catalog is from 1982. It does not represent current pricing.
I remember those catalogs, though. Speaking of it, there was two things that I remember as a young person in bluegrass and music. We got the warehouse music catalog that was more instrument but also had albums, and the county sales catalog.
Right,
those were the ones that you lived by because you get those to come in, and also there were others, Elderly Music and Mandolin Brothers and
Stuart McDonald.
And Stu McDonald. And these were all companies that had this beginning of what became the internet sales of catalog sales, basically. Yes. I think it is the intro to that, which is very interesting now that I think about that.
Yeah, Janet Davis.
Yeah, Janet Davis was a big one.
First Quality did their big catalog.
Yep, the Sullivan's. Yeah.
So it was an interesting time, that is unlike now where you just go to the internet, you go to eBay or I know there's a specialty sites that you would know of that sell guitars, and you just watch them now, and then you go to stores.
The only specialty site that anybody needs to know is the acousticshoppe.com.
Yes, right.
Open 24 hours a day.
Really the only website online where you buy instruments.
Yeah. Well, and it's cool that you have a store also for the people that can actually get to it, and you can hold the instrument in your hand and play it. And I don't think, you can do it otherwise, and it'd be fine, but it's really nice and comforting to be able to play the instrument that you ultimately select.
Yeah.
And you all, just a strictly mail order place, you can't do that. They may allow you to return it, but that's a big mess. Trying to return instruments.
Except for the Acoustic Shoppe, where you can return all instruments. No.
We have a 14-day return policy.
No.
There's both sides of this world, right?
Definitely.
And I think we've discussed this many times with music stores. You're right. The catalog or just a warehouse style of music store is tough. And I think the advantage of a shop like ours, and there are others like this, I'm not just trying to say that we're the only ones, is that even if you can't make it to that store, you still know that company or the people there.
They're not just a warehouse.
They're not a warehouse that just pulls a box off of a shelf and just, all right, we got an order for such and such, and we put it in the box and go. There has to be different. This, and I think this is also kind of fun thing to talk about a little bit, is relationships between a musician and their instruments. You've had a relationship with your current Stelling banjo for a very long time.
Yes.
And it's part of what makes you who you are. And I think that's part of, why we try to connect people with those music or with those instruments. But you've told a story about how you and Jeff kind of got together, and how long this current banjo that you're using right now, the Stelling, how long have you been using that one?
I'm probably over 20 years, but I've got my Staghorn, which I've played for 40 years or longer.
Mm-hmm. And you feel like, that changed you as a musician. Every one of the instruments that you have had throughout the years probably has giving you a different insight of how you play music, correct?
Exactly. Every instrument has its little things that it offers, that you might not find on another instrument. So it's nuanced and subtle in some ways, but can ultimately build into a whole cascade of things that, you can do. So it's very, very important to be comfortable with your instrument.
Sure.
One of the coolest things, I think, it was kind of one of those, big world view moments, but Tom Bedell came and did a seminar on, he builds Bedell guitars and Breed Love. And we were talking about, how much guitars open up, and specifically to guitars in that conversation, but they open up the more you play them, and, the wood kind of, based on the vibrations that are being put into them, responds to that and changes the actual output of that instrument. I'm sure the same happens with banjo and mandolin, all these instruments. But one of the coolest points that he made was that's why it actually becomes an extension of that player, because everybody has a different attack to it. They have a different tone they get out of an instrument, and you're imparting some of your personal technique into that instrument. So it almost becomes like a fingerprint of Alan Mundy, like that banjo in your hands. And I know people have talked about Tony Rice with his guitar in his hands versus anybody else holding it. Like it actually becomes an extension of them because of the vibrations you're putting into that instrument. It's actually changing the makeup of it.
Jeremy got very, very hippy dippy there for a second. I mean, that felt space meta.
I was about to cry.
I got very meta, guys. But it's an interesting thing to think of, that all those 40 years you've put into that banjo, it has an Alan Mundy sound to it, because that's all it's really, the music. And that's, we did that big video on Bill Monroe's mandolin, and because of all those road years that he played it, and the conditions it went through and all the different environments, it became that instrument because of Monroe. So it's like an extension physically of the player.
I totally agree.
Those that didn't see this on video, I had an aha moment, and I was just like a wide open mouth and the whole deal. Should we be selling artists' instruments so that the players can get imparted with that artist's soul that you...
We take Alan Mundy's
It
banjo
doesn't go
and
backwards.
Does it not go that way?
No, you can't extract the Alan Mundy from the banjo. It just...
Yeah.
it is Alan Mundy.
Although another fine product that I think we should get into doing, Alan Mundy
Probably extract. Some drool and sweat.
What
Sweat and
is
drool
what
that was
is
left
Alan
on the
Mundy
banjo.
extract?
Moving on.
Can you put that in a jar?
Let's move on.
Forget that. I'm going to say this podcast would be a failure if we didn't discuss a little bit of Jimmy Martin in it, because that was one of my musical heroes. I think one of our favorite bluegrass artists growing up, and you're obviously a big part of that for a long time.
For a short time.
For a short time.
How long was it?
It was actually almost exactly 2 years.
Yeah.
It was October of 71 or 69 to October of 71.
How did the initial introduction to Jimmy happen in your audition?
Well, I mean, it's a long story, but I knew a banjo player named Al Osteen, and I'd met him at a festival. I went to the very first Bill Monroe festival in Bean Blossom, and I don't think he was there the first year, but I went there the second year. I was still in college. I went with Ralph Thomas' family up there, and the second year, Butch Robbins and I and Al Osteen spent a fair amount of time playing music together. And Al is a very fine player from South Carolina. And it's a long story how I went to Nashville, but I was in Nashville for the DJ. Back then it was called the DJ Convention. Now it's Fan Fest. And at the time, I think Tut Taylor was the instigator of it, would rent a suite if not a whole floor, I don't know, maybe just a suite of a hotel called the Noel, Noel Hotel. And it's just up the street from the Opry, and host bluegrass pickers for the entire length of the DJ convention. And so I went there, met up with Sam Bush and Wayne Stewart, and we spent the whole weekend. Al came over. He was playing with Jim and Jesse at the time. Along with the fiddle player at the time was Big Joe Green, if you remember that name at all. And Al came over and, hey, Al, how are you doing? I'm Alan, how are you? I'm doing fine. And he said, Chris Warner was leaving Jimmy Martin. Are you interested in playing banjo with Jimmy Martin? Well, of course I am, you know. And he said, well, he'll probably be up here later. I'll introduce you. And so Jimmy came up. Al introduced me.
How did you know that Jimmy came into the room? Like, so quietly.
He was the only one.
Little wallflower on the side.
Yeah, he snuck in.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Yeah. No. He had been over somewhere to the Opry, and he was all duded up in his checkered coat and big hat. And
checkered hat that was a different color than his checkered jacket.
Yeah. And he had Gloria Bell with him, who played bass.
Yeah.
I admire her very much. But she was flicked up also, so they came in. And Doyle Lawson came with him, and I had met Doyle prior to this and played banjo, which is yet another story. But Doyle knew me, and so I introduced myself to Jimmy, or Al did, and I said, I'm interested in playing. Okay, well, I'll be back tomorrow, and I'll listen to you play. So he came back the next night, and I remember I played Cumberland Gap is one of the things I played. And he right away started instructing me on how to play it, which was just the model for the entire time I was with him. And anybody that plays music around him, he will instruct you. He just can't not do it. And so he said, we'll be back here. We're playing next weekend in Xenia, Ohio, I think it was. So I went home, packed up all my stuff, drove back to Nashville, got in Nashville on a Wednesday, and on, I guess, Friday, midnight, I was in the bus driving out to this gig. And the first gig I ever saw Jimmy Martin was I was the banjo player, because I had never seen him before. I only knew his recordings. And that's how I sort of wound up there. And Doyle helped a lot, because Doyle had worked with Jimmy sometime prior to this time as a banjo player. And if Jimmy couldn't find a banjo player, Doyle was going to have to do the next gigs.
Sure.
And Doyle did not want to do that. So
he put in a good word for you.
He put in a good word for me. And he and I lived together for only a month or two there in Nashville. Then he quit and went back with JD. He had left JD to come down and work with Jimmy. So Doyle was very helpful and a very nice man about it all, and helped me in my banjo playing, and kind of showed me some Jimmy Martin-esque things. So I tried my best. And I always tell this story because it's kind of interesting. An insight to Jimmy Martin is during the set we played, and it was at a package show. There was other country performers on there. George Morgan, who is Lori Morgan's father, was a big star at one time, but by then he was sort of knocked down a notch or two. But it was a package show. And so we're playing a song that's sort of a medium to slow song. And I started doing this Earl Scruggs kind of backup that's just on, I don't know how to describe it. Some people use the term teardrops, but that's
popcorn or
yeah, something. It's just two strings back and forth, kind of like a piano. Mm-hmm. Back and forth. And I didn't get hardly one measure of it out. And Jimmy is singing at the microphone, playing his guitar, and he turns around and says, "Don't do that." Turns back around, And afterwards he explained to me, he said, I'm not angry or anything, but that's not my music. That is Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs' music. It's not my timing. So we'll find something else to do. And it's sort of an insight into this idea that I believe those early players had a fairly strong sense of their style. Mm-hmm. And they were this and they were not that. And so Jimmy Martin was Jimmy Martin and not Flatt and Scruggs. And he wasn't Bill Monroe, and he wasn't Reno and Smiley or the Osborne brothers or Jim and Jesse. They all had, every one of those had their own way of doing it. Mm-hmm. And Jimmy had his way. And so it was helped me understand that he had a sense of a band style.
Sure.
And we would watch bands play at festivals. And his comment would be something like this. He says, there are 4 guys up there doing the best they can. And what he meant by it, I think, was that each player was playing the way they wanted to play and did not have a unified approach to the music where, he had instructed everybody, the bass player, the fiddle player, the mandolin player, the banjo player, and how you sing. Everything came with instructions.
Gotcha.
And it was this way, that's the way I wanted. And the more you got that, the more he liked you, and the less you got it, the less he liked you. He would talk about players in his band that worked with him before that he didn't like. And most of it had to do with the fact that they never committed to doing what he wanted.
Sure.
And when I left him and got out in the world, people would ask me about playing with him. They'd say, I hear he wants you to play it the same way every time. And I said, that's true. And I did it. And I tried my best. And they would respond, I could never be in a band like that. And I would say, I wouldn't say it, but I go, you're absolutely right. You couldn't. You're not good enough.
That's actually true. That actually is true.
I mean, to be able to play good and then reproduce it the next time and the next time and the next time and the next time, was the challenge and he wanted, basically, he felt like what people wanted to hear was what you had recorded. Yeah. And I went to see Jim and Jesse with Alan Shelton. And this was years after he had left and then came back. And the fiddle player was, and you maybe, Jimmy Campbell.
Yeah.
Who has passed on. Mm-hmm. And when they did Standing on the Mountain, Alan Shelton played exactly what he played on the record. Mm-hmm. Jimmy Campbell wasn't the fiddle player on the record, but he played exactly what was on the record. And you know what? I loved it. And I was with them in the sense that that's what I wanted to hear in the audience myself, is that same, I didn't want to hear somebody, it wouldn't be Alan Shelton, but another banjo player go, oh man, he should have listened to the record, So it was beautiful to hear him play, and Jesse played what he played on the record. Alan Shelton backed him up the same way pretty much as on the record. So it was a real, classic performance of a song. And Jimmy felt that that's what people wanted. Yeah. And I wasn't going to argue with him.
There's a good argument to that, and without getting way into the weeds here on this, I've talked about this a few times. I think that especially people who aren't educated in the world of music, that don't play music necessarily, that when they listen to something that they've grown up and they've heard their entire life, and you just listen to this, and this is something that you have a reverence for. You love this particular rendition, this song, this whatever it happens to be, and you listen to that first time of somebody changing something on that you listen to. I think the human reaction almost always is, that's wrong. Now, sometimes it takes a while for you to recognize that that's another way to do that. And I think that's where, at least that's what had to happen for me. I used to be very, very stuck in the mud on that, where I listen to something and I'm like, you changed that song, it's wrong. And that goes back to our traditional versus progressive deal. It takes a while to kind of go and listen to it again and go, all right, that's a cool idea. I see where that's coming from, and be able to kind of work with that. But I think there's a right to what Jimmy's saying here. Those people who listen to that album all the time that are going out to see Jimmy perform it for that time, that's what they want to hear. That's why they're there. They wanted to hear that.
Exactly.
And
he knew enough that, he was the lead singer, but he knew enough to go, no, they're interested in my banjo player. They're interested in my mandolin player. They're interested in my tenor singer, and he wanted it all to be good. Whereas, and I'm not putting down anybody, but country artists have a band leader, and it's the band leader that gets the band going. The country artist, he just goes out there and sings his song. And the band leader is the one that wants to get the licks from the recording on there, So, and the band and the artist, as long as that happens, they're happy, because they can sing their hit record,
sure,
with their hit licks on it. And it's real interesting. And back to his comment, if you take a band, and like this guy that made the comment to me, their idea is that, no, I like to improvise. Well, what if you have a bad day? So in a sense, the guy did the best he could that day. And that's what Jimmy was talking about. They're doing the best they can. They haven't really studied what they're doing. And I just want to mention one other quick thing is I played with Byron Berline, who played Sally Gooden. And he had a way of playing Sally Gooden that he played every time exactly the same. Now, over the years, he's added stuff in it. But before he gets to the stuff he's added, he plays exactly what he played. Mm-hmm. And so I could back him up in exactly the same way every time because I knew exactly what he was going to play. And you take the other kind of approach to that, and I'm not really against it. You have to develop your sort of sensibility about why you're playing music and what music is. But I've seen bands, they start out with Sally Gooden. By the end of it, it's like a rock tune. Mm-hmm. It's just play all over the place. And it's, for me, it's like saying, Sally Gooden is not good enough. It's better if I do all this other stuff. Where for me, I'm saying Sally Gooden is plenty good enough as Sally Gooden. Yeah. So, but I love improvised music, so don't get me wrong that I don't like it.
I get exactly what you're saying.
It's just that some things you can improvise on, and they're made to do that. If I did Rubin's Train, which is just a loaded D, that's kind of wide open to a certain extent. But if you play Sally Gooden, to me, that's next to my heart. So I want it to be Sally Gooden. So, it's just, and those things become like Jimmy Martin, it's part of your style. Don't do that. When somebody starts playing rock licks on Sally Gooden, you want to turn around and go, don't do that. But if you could do in Rubin's Train, pour it on. It's just a matter of taste, I guess, ultimately.
Yeah. I'm thinking you're talking about the control that Jimmy had over his music and why he took control and the reasons. It makes a lot of sense if you think about a lot of the older artists that we used to play with back in the day, that Mac Wiseman, for one, mm-hmm. Chubby Weiss. Those guys would kind of, and it's the same analogy you're talking about with the country artists, is they'd show up and put together a band on the spot and have no control over that. And it wasn't what was on the record. And it was always a letdown to hear them play.
Wow, let's not go all the way to let down.
There's really one
part of you that, yes, I got what you're saying.
When you have somebody that's playing the wrong notes and the wrong, they're just band together, you're really not really wanting to sit and listen to that music. And it makes a lot of sense of Jimmy, and he might have got a lot of flack for it, for having that kind of control, but it makes sense. It always performed.
And it's somewhat admirable, especially at that time in country music. A lot of the artists would try to sound like the other country artists, and they would all end up recording the hit that's on the record that the other guy did, and try to steal some of their audience. Where a lot of those bluegrass guys did have that opinion that, all right, that's his sound. I don't want to try to emulate that. I want people to know this is Jimmy Martin or this is Osborne or
exactly. Just one other quick thing is, when Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs were with Bill Monroe, I I think this to be true, and I think I've read it, is they rehearsed a lot. So they went and performed. It was this highly rehearsed band. And that's what Jimmy Martin, living in Sneedville, Tennessee, heard. And what people heard was this really highly polished band. When Jimmy went with Monroe, Flatt and Scruggs were gone, Mac Wiseman was gone. And he said sometimes it would just be Bill and I going out. And there'd be, Bill would call up some banjo player you knew or some fiddle player you knew, and we'd play. And he was always disappointed in that aspect of his time with Bill Monroe, was that it was not a rehearsed unit. And he would go on the Opry, and he would see Ernest Tubbs' band. He said they're all dressed real sharp. They all had their licks programmed. Hank Williams' band, little Jimmy Dickens had twin guitars.
Sure.
And, Buddy Emmons on the steel, and, just this really slick music. And that's what he wanted in bluegrass. That was his goal. And at one time, he had in the band Bill Emerson and Paul Williams, and the bass player, I don't know, but he had a girl singer named Lois Johnson, and a bass singer that played the snare drum, who's Kirk Hansard. And Lois and Kirk, I think, were married. And they did a gospel album together, and that song Tennessee, I Hear You Calling Me, they did that, and they did a few others that are sprinkled out through the albums. And he said that was the best band. Now, it wasn't his favorite of all the, he loved Bill Emerson a lot, and J.D. Crowe a lot, and Paul Williams a lot. I don't know about the bass player, but he said that's the closest I got to the band that I wanted, that could do anything I wanted. And it had a show element to it. The bass player did comedy. Lois Johnson was the girl singer. And then Kirk was sort of a smooth-voiced singer. And that's the band he went to Vegas with. He got a gig at Vegas and worked out.
What a wild time there. Jimmy Martin in Vegas.
That's another podcast.
Yeah. Well,
leave that one for cocaine and rhinestones.
Yeah. You'll have to talk to somebody else. I wasn't there. But it was, he had this vision about how he wanted his music and how he wanted it to sound. And that was, his models were, those country artists that had those really polished bands. And that's what he wanted in bluegrass. So when he'd say there's four guys just doing the best they can, that was, to indicate that they need to work more and have a concept.
I just appreciated that he was in the audience watching us. So that,
I get it. Anyway,
Alan, I got to say right now, I know that this is going to have to be a repeat guest, because
I was going to say, we haven't
even scratched the surface of things that you have done and been a part of that I want to hear more about, and I know the audience is going to want to hear more about. So if we can twist your arm to come back in here again, we are going to have to do it.
Sure.
Because,
oh gosh.
I mean, I just want a whole podcast of Sam Bush anecdotes, just so the next time I see him, I can say, oh yeah, I remember that time then you and Alan did that one thing. You want to be my friend?
Yeah.
I know Alan Mundy. Can we be friends?
But it is true that this was your era of getting started. We spent a lot of time talking about this beginning of your career in bluegrass. We haven't even got to the stuff that everybody really knows Alan Mundy for, and I think that's still to come. That's my. We didn't talk about country gazette. We didn't talk about
just the melodic style. Yeah. Sure.
All right.
It has in the afternoon. Yeah.
We'll have to reschedule it. We have a live stream tomorrow.
Yeah, you do.
Anyway, this has been a whole bunch of fun. Again, I absolutely love having Alan. I meant it when I started this in the beginning. One of my favorite human beings. And it's not just us that have said this. By the way, I want to tell you, there was a lot of folks that came by. So they've been seeing that you've been hanging out at the shop more. We were at IBMA. A lot of people came by the booth and said, hey, I see you guys have been hanging out with Alan. One of my favorite individuals in the entire world. Absolutely. And that was said
the most generous
multiple times.
It just proves right now how generous he is. He sat here for an hour and a half to 2 hours just talking with us.
Yeah.
But
Could I
during
just-
instruction and all that, I've seen him instruct banjo players, and just the most generous person.
Yeah, I agree with that.
This, and I think
And I would just like to encourage everybody to buy one of my CDs.
Especially the most recent one.
Yeah, the most recent
that
one.
I got to be part of.
Yeah, that
just skip the songs that
Jeremy is on. Yeah.
Only one, but
It's only one.
you can listen
Yeah,
to the
but
rest of it.
it's pretty great.
I loved it.
You know, I listen to it every time it comes on. I go, wow, that is so gnarly
It was
in a
fun.
good way.
See,
Had
that's
a
what
bunch
I
of
think too, except not in a good way. But I love
Definitely
Alan's
check
part
that
of
out.
it.
It's called Excelsior, and you need to get your copy of it now.
Yeah, it is good. It's actually absolutely
Also on
fabulous
it,
album.
Sam Bush, Steve Smith, Kim Warner,
Ron Pennington,
Ron Pennington, that one guy from Canada.
Emery Lester. Yeah, Emery. Yeah. Don
lots of-
Stierenberg.
Yeah,
Don
Stierenberg.
Stierenberg.
Yeah, great stuff.
Yeah.
Just great musicians, and then I
Noah-
got to be a part of it.
I want to mention Noah Jeffries, who's a little known player, but he's an Austin area guy that is a great, great fiddle player and a great mandolin player, and plays with all kinds of musicians down in Austin. Noah Jeffries, great.
Sweet. It is a great album. It's
great to listen
It's
to.
a great fella. I'm glad we had him in here. Jason, thank you for making this happen.
I'm just so glad that when we called him, he was sitting right here. It's coincidental.
he doesn't leave, so I mean, we can do this.
I actually
He lives
sleep
here.
right back over here and pick on that guitar there from time to time.
You guys notice every once in a while you see his head poking out during live streams or whatnot. Always look for Alan in the back.
Just checking to make sure nobody's in the bathroom so I can go in.
We'll end it with that.
Thanks again, Alan.
All right, thank you.
Get our notes together for the next batch of questions.
All righty.
We'll start where we left off.
All right, sounds good.
All right.
Well, again, Alan Mundy, a whole bunch of fun to be around.
Can you believe that?
And honestly, we didn't even come close to any, that's the cool thing about these conversations when he comes in. There's so many things to discuss. We haven't even scratched the surface. There's so much more to talk about. So I'm going to put in a plea that he comes
formal
back.
request.
Official request.
Yeah, I've got a certified letter that we'll be sending his way.
We'll make it.
Which is weird, be hand delivered by one of us. It's not even that far. Why would
It's going to be
you?
one of those trick thing, you got served sort of things like, oh, can you sign for this package delivery, sir? And you got served.
I get it. No, like I said, honestly, one of the most generous people that we've spent time with, and just friendships abound when he's around. Everybody loves him.
I'm not sure what that means, but
I don't know what that means either.
good.
Are we making like 100
things.
friendships with one person?
Everybody that is around Alan is a friend.
I got you now.
Follow me. Anyway,
I try to follow you. It's not
I think it was another good podcast.
I can't wait till the next
feel
one. What do you guys want to do now?
It's happened. Good. I don't know. I gotta go get my kids.
Alan, you got anything going on?
Oh, you want to go eat?
No, well, I'm in.
All right.
That is the weirdest thing. He was here this whole time.
Oh. Oh, was that a hint?
I think when we said,
Alan, can you lock
we're done?
up after you're done?
I will.
Our next guest is coming. Alan, could you?
Yeah, I'll.
Thanks for keeping that seat
move out
warm.
of the way. My seat is still warm.
No, seriously, it's time for you to go now. The Acoustic Shoppe Knows People, handmade by Trent Pruitt, Hinkley Hinkleston, and Jason Chapman for the Acoustic Shoppe.
Theme song written and performed by Ofer Koren.
And please remember to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.